Hey there, I'm John Wolf, also known as Super Dude or Super, whichever you prefer to use, and, well, this one's less of a game design thing and more something that's been on my mind for a bit, so let's just get into it. Horror games. Spooky games that fill you with adrenaline through different means than most. Games, as a whole, want to make you feel cool or smart or like a badass. Horror games instead aim to make you feel weak, stupid, and like a little baby who's afraid to walk through a door of all things.
What was that?
It's one of the few genres of game that is actively daring you to turn it off by trying to spook your pants nonstop. And while there are plenty of games in this genre that people love, it is a relatively niche interest in the gaming space. The highest selling shooter is the game PUBG, the world's first massive foray into the battle royale genre, which has allowed for this multiversal insanity we now live in. 75 million copies. Best-selling racing game is Mario Kart. Over, and over, and over, and over again. Best-selling action-adventure game? Grand Theft Auto 5, selling a cool and collected 175 million units. Best-selling horror game is Dying Light, the parkour survival game by Techland, selling 20 million copies. Perhaps this is what happens when you make a game that is daring the player to turn it off. Some people don't even start. This is the unfortunate reality of making games in this genre. All your efforts, your hard work, it could spook away the normies, or conversely, not be hard enough for those who are really in it for the thrill, the cathartic release of the scare. It's a delicate balancing act for, what is comparatively, smaller profits. Why can't we just make a Call of Duty? That's the sort of question the large horror publishers were asking themselves around a decade ago, and led to a slew of releases that devastated the AAA horror space for years to follow. Thankfully, things are better now, and we currently live through a resurgence of some of horror's biggest flagship franchises, but those same franchises almost killed the genre way back. What happened? How did we come back from this major blow? This is the modern history of AAA horror games. Their fall, what filled their spot, and how now they're coming back from the dead. See, it's like a zombie from. Have you ever played Resident? Quick things before we go. Here are the games I'm going to be spoiling. I have them up on screen now. If you don't want to be spoiled on anything in them, skip their sections. And 2, this is a modern horror history from the AAA perspective. There are some indie games I'm going to be talking about because they have super important roles to play in this story, but it isn't the focus. I'm not going to be at all comprehensive or even really telling you what years these things came out, so just know that going in, I'm really only talking about AAA releases here. There are 3 franchises I would like to point out to you, as they are important to the greater story we are going to tell. Resident Evil, published by Capcom, is a game about zombies. I can't get more into detail than that. The games have been through so many tonal changes already in its short lifespan that the one thing they all have in common for now is that it's about zombies. It's got zombies in it. The story involves larger-than-life badasses who go on campy romps through various zombie settings. The story may take itself seriously, might not, but regardless, it's always campy. We also have Silent Hill, published by Konami, a psychological horror franchise that seeks to inure the main character and you in horror vibes. These games tend to be character studies, exploring ordinary people with dark secrets, who accidentally end up in the pseudo-real town of Silent Hill, which tortures them for their past sins. The game isn't concerned with making physical sense, or any sense at all. It is an unknowable world that bends itself to hurt you. Horror vibes. Lastly, Dead Space. Dead Space was developed by Visceral Entertainment, a studio owned by EA, and isn't nearly as old as the other 2 franchises listed, but its impact was huge in the moment. It is a survival horror game set in space where you have to fight necromorphs, creatures that take the flesh of the recently dead and morph it into terrifying death monsters. You play as Isaac Clarke, rushing through various industrial hellscapes trying to fix machines, surgically destroy the necromorphs that get in your way, and find your hot girlfriend, who's a little too young for you, Isaac. I feel now is an important time to distinguish between horror and terror. Terror is what I earlier called horror vibes. It is the lead-up of the true scare. The unease, the walking down dark hallways, hearing noises in the walls, the calm before the climactic shock of horror, the jump scare. The payoff. If Silent Hill is terror, Dead Space is horror. Loud monsters, shrill, jagged violins, constant jump scares. Resident Evil is an anomaly. You see, Resident Evil began as one of the first true survival horror games as we see them today, and is a living parent of the genre. It took itself decently seriously in its first couple entries, or so everyone remembers.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Look what I've found.
What?
A can of fizz. It's sure to yellow and mellow those things.
Fever gone, but itchy. Today hungry and eat doggy food.
Resident Evil 4 took a new direction with the series, and does an admirable job of towing the line between action and horror. It was a game that went through multiple versions, protagonists, and vibes before eventually landing on this. A parasitic body horror in a gothic setting, which has a lot of spy thriller vibes and is probably the campiest Resident Evil has ever intentionally been. So on the dichotomy, it'd be about here. It's still definitely scary, but it's not trying to be as scary as the other two. It's campy fun horror vibes that may genuinely scare you, but only in spurts. This is probably the reason Resident Evil is one of the best-selling horror franchises to date. It doesn't try to push the boundaries of terror, yet, so it's the lowest bar to entry. Let's start in the year 2005. Horror games were coming out having a pretty good time as far as AAA releases go, but we had a bit of a problem. The survival horror genre was getting pretty stale, as evidenced by both Resident Evil 3 Nemesis's experimentation in the genre and its lack of sales compared to its predecessors. So, they experimented. They decided to add more action than they have ever done before, and after a couple of trials, Resident Evil 4 comes out, and everyone loves it. It is from RE4's mold that Dead Space comes to be, as the designers looked at RE4 and said, yep, love that, more of that please. And what was originally a System Shock style game morphed through love of RE4 into the body horror gorefest we know and love today. Riding off the success of RE4, Capcom leaned further into the action to make Resident Evil 5, an action horror game which probably would not be made today if we had to do it again, because the optics of what Chris is doing here is... RE5 is built from the ground up with cooperative play in mind, with the first player controlling Chris and the second person controlling Sheva. Left-handed. As I'm sure you can guess by my simping, Sheva is a left-handed character. She's one of the only ones in all of shooters, and she is authentically represented down to basically every animation she has. Shout out to History of Handedness in Video Games by Faceful of Eyes. It is an extremely geeky and deep dive into this subject, and there's nothing I love more than that. While we have completely abandoned horror vibes in exchange for horror aesthetics, this is actually a very competent co-op shooter, and it is the highest selling Resident Evil game to this day, selling more on its own than the entire Silent Hill series. Fast forward a bit to the year 2011. Dead Space 2 comes out and gets 2 million copies within the first week, a major step up from its predecessor's 1 million over its lifetime. This easily made it crush its contemporaries, but in the greater game space? As I said, this is an unfair comparison already, but it didn't stop EA from making that comparison. 2 million copies is too low for EA, and they almost cancel Visceral's upcoming projects in retaliation. EA gives Visceral an ultimatum: sell 5 million copies on your next game, or we're pulling the plug. With that encouragement from their benefactors, Visceral sets about drawing more than double their previous number for their next game. Within the same year, Fear or Fear 3 comes out, a series I have not mentioned, which did some pretty interesting things with AI design in their earlier installments. The first game comes out the same year as Resident Evil 4 did, and went on to release 6 titles within the 6-year period. Fear is not well received, and the franchise dies. The following year, Silent Hill Downpour comes out. Silent Hill Downpour centers Murphy Pendleton, a criminal who, within the first 30 minutes of the game, murders someone inside of prison. This is a new framing for Silent Hill. No ordinary person with a dark secret, but an actively dark individual who ends up in Silent Hill. What sort of psychological horrors await a person who wears his crimes on his sleeves? While the story is considered pretty good, that's about all that Downpour had going for it. Critics criticize the performance and combat often, so the story is really all it has going for it, and your enjoyment will hinge on if you like that or not. In terms of Silent Hills, this one is middling, which is unfortunate because this will be the last Silent Hill for reasons we'll get into later. Meanwhile, in the Capcom corner, Resident Evil 6 seeks to be the biggest, baddest game on the horror block. According to an IGN interview with one of RE6's producers, Yoshiaki Hirabayashi, the game was meant to be, quote, the ultimate horror entertainment, striking an exquisite balance of all the things people love about the series.
Exquisite balance of all the things people love about the series.
RE6 tries to be all things to all people, and that means being all the different types of horror. Leon's story is a true horror game in line with RE4, but taking itself way more seriously. Chris's story is basically Call of Duty with zombies, and is aggressively boring to play, until the end when your partner gains superpowers, which is cool I guess, but why did you wait all the way to the end of the game, like the last 10 minutes before you gave me? And Jake's story, which features a returned child character made adult, and now she's a romantic interest, which, if you played that game, gross, but gameplay-wise, it's like a full-throated action game, with each of the characters having superpowers. I won't deny I had the most fun playing this one, but it's definitely least consistent of the bunch. And lastly, Ada's story, which exists to tie together loose ends from the story of the game so they make sense, and let me tell you, the answers aren't worth it. If you're here at Ada's story, that means you've played the other ones. You've been inside of RE6 for almost 20 hours. The secret at the back isn't gonna make you feel good about the time you've spent. The game sold well, sure, but it sold well on false promises and on Resident Evil's reputation, which is now in jeopardy. After fans got a hold of it, everyone saw it was rancid. This isn't horror. This is someone chasing that Call of Duty paper. It alienated fans of the franchise who yelled loud enough to let normies know better than to come close. Resident Evil, in trying to be everything, flew too close to the sun and died. Kind of. Next up, Visceral is firing on all cylinders trying to increase their sales. They chased trends of other action horror games that worked so well for them. Co-op, a crafting system, a greater focus on action with most horror stripped out entirely, a love subplot. Sorry, not subplot, plot. The game is basically about this love triangle that makes me want to eat my feet. It also included microtransactions. All of this put a sour taste in people's mouths, who felt this was a major departure from what made Dead Space distinct. It lost its gameplay identity, and it sold worse than its predecessors, dooming the series. A DLC was released tying up the story of the games. I say tying in quotes because it isn't really an ending so much as, well, complete and utter damnation. It's kind of the same hole that Mass Effect wrote themselves into, where the threat to society is so devastating that there's no conceivable way it isn't at least apocalyptic. I wonder if there's a similar drive behind both games going in that. They conceived of a game to make after this, but it makes just as much sense for the world of Dead Space to be so ruined that all hope is lost and there are no more games to be made. Kind of a bummer, but at what point did Dead Space make you feel optimistic for the world's survival? Seems fitting for it to end like this, honestly. Visceral will go on to make a couple of games for EA's other titles, and then work on some licensed Star Wars games before those projects were cancelled, and the studio right along with it. Rest in peace, Visceral Games. I miss you every half year when I boot up Dead Space 2 again. So with Dead Space following its inspiration off of the action cliff, it seems that all we have left is Silent Hill. So what does Konami have planned for the franchise? Anyway, let's talk about PT, this random short horror game that appeared on PlayStation 4 the following year. It's free, so we might as well give it a go. It features a nameless, voiceless dude walking through a house listening to a radio detailing a recent crime where multiple family members were killed in the same violent incident. Continuing through the door at the end of the hall, you discover that you are in a loop, and this place is haunted. Or perhaps haunting you. Tension builds as you repeat the loops and discover that things have moved, things have changed, or perhaps new entities are in the halls completely. The tension continuously builds, letting go in some key moments, but likely due to its short length, it does a remarkable job of towing when to make you uneasy and when to really scare you. Only through finding the puzzle pieces and knowing the secret codes necessary to escape will the door to the true outside open, and the mystery reveal itself. PT is a promotional trailer for Silent Hills, the newest game in the series, directed by Hideo Kojima of Metal Gear fame alongside Guillermo del Toro of all people. With such a promising trailer, people were ecstatic. Remember earlier when I said Silent Hill's sales numbers are quite meager compared to Resident Evil? Silent Hill may be one of the horror darlings, but that doesn't mean it makes gangbusters. But in this climate, things could be different. With the other AAA franchises gone, Silent Hill stood to dominate the space and take horror in a bold new direction all its own and dominate! I'm just kidding, they cancelled it. Konami announced that, with few exceptions, they would stop producing console games in favor of increased mobile game development, which Silent Hills is likely a casualty of. Kojima and Konami's relationship became strained during all this time, though the reasons are unknown and I will not speculate. He was barred from receiving the award for the final Metal Gear at the Keighley Extravaganza by the studio, and he left the company soon after. You could later see that a lot of Kojima's ideas for Silent Hills morphed into Death Stranding in some way. This became that became this became Dead Man. But as for the Silent Hill series, it was, due to studio reworks, killed. And with that, the AAA horror space died its last death. Y'all might think I'm being dramatic, and I am. Horror games still happened, but most large horror games were flops for a long time after 2013. Other horror games releasing alongside Dead Space 3 included Aliens Colonial Marines, Dead Island Riptide, Dead Rising 3, and Metro Last Light, which is actually pretty good. I recommend you try it. Dead Island sold rather well, then dissipated on its own due to development issues. Dead Rising 3 sold pretty well too, actually. Let's put a pen in Dead Rising, we'll come back to this. In PT's year, we have a new Castlevania, Aliens Isolation, and Evil Within. All reviewed well, but not a single one sold well. 2015, we have Dying Light, Resident Evil Revelations 2, because if you were king, your corpse can still dream, and Until Dawn, which actually does pretty well for itself. You see a bit of a bounce back this year, but only with new ideas. Turns out people enjoy innovation. Crazy. And in 2016, we have, let's see, oh yeah, Dead Rising 4. A game which completely changed the tone of the original, was poorly received, and killed the series. You see, during this time, the AAA space was filled with great games, but people weren't having it. The large commercial failures of Resident Evil and Dead Space cooled people's hunger for this sort of thing, so large-scale horror experiences just weren't palatable to the public at this time. The games that manage to succeed out of this are far less terrifying, and instead lean into horror aesthetics, or as I call them, horror vibes, for accessibility's sake, which is great for them, get that paper. But where were the fans of true jumps and spooks during this time? Well, that's easy. They moved to the indie space. Way back in 2010, a game came out called Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Maybe you've heard of it. It is a 19th century romp through a castle as a dude who lost his memory, and is now stuck in this castle with supernatural happenings and disfigured monsters. The thing that made Amnesia distinct, and it later popularized a design trend, is the lack of any combat abilities. If a monster comes up to you, you can't shoot it, you can't whack it, and you certainly can't dismember it. You have to run and hide, maybe use traps in the environment. This complete disempowerment was fresh and new, and plenty of indie games went on to use this mechanic, or lack of one. We see SCP Containment Breach, the various Slender games, Outlast, one of the big ones to come out of this, Among the Sleep, Layers of Fear, and of course, who can forget, Five Nights at Freddy's. You may notice all of these are YouTube games, and that isn't on accident. Let's Play channels did a lot to popularize horror games for the next generation, and especially since you're experiencing it alongside a cartoonish personality, it makes the scares easier to handle. Each of these games leaves you very disempowered for a grand portion of their runtimes, but I'd like to point out Five Nights at Freddy's as a particularly interesting take on the idea here. The Five Nights games at their prime were god-level views of their domains, but on a timer. You survey your cameras and maintain whatever extra bits and bobs need maintaining in the sequels, keeping eyes on your power consumption and animatronic locations. They will try to kill you, and you can bat them away with virtually no issue, but doing so costs power. Run out of power, and your god-level stopping ability is now a human-level stopping ability. And they're made out of metal. The best way to keep safe is to stop them before they get to your door and force you to use power, which requires you to keep a bead on them through your cameras. So you must keep a survey of your kingdom, keeping all plates spinning, and if you drop even one of those plates, you get punished with a jump scare. This is beautiful tension building. You're hyper-focused on your tasks, feeling the dread of any mistake and the possibility that at any time when you look away from your tablet, they're there, waiting to spook ya. The downside is that you eventually get good enough or inured to the jumps to such a degree that the scares don't even remotely work anymore, but that can't really be helped with this design. Or can it? Shout out to Five Nights 1 and 4, I love the design of these two. I know the reputation this game has due to its mystery, but I'm ignoring that. I don't want it, I'm not touching it. The game is good. Don't talk to me about Purple Men. So, we're in a bloom of indie horror over AAA horror that has lasted for years. Every AAA series mentioned so far has died, save one. Resident Evil, the dead king, still dreams. What could bring that king back from the dead, reanimate its corpse to kill again? Not unlike a necromorph from Dead Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. This game is notable for its dual names. In English-speaking countries, it's Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, but in its home country of Japan, it is Biohazard 7 Resident Evil. The reference to the name across the sea is more than just a cute nod to us English folk. Resident Evil is named such due to the insidious manners that the game was originally named for. The Spencer Mansion and the museum-turned-police station are RE1 and 2, respectively. These residencies are evil. And for the first time in a long time, we once again have an evil house in the Baker Mansion. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard has returned to form, attempting to take what was great about these original horror experiences and give it a fresh perspective, both figuratively and literally. We got a new protagonist, new villains, almost no returning characters, and a new setting for the series. That's the figurative, but we literally change perspectives in that this game and its next are in first person. This change cannot be overstated. Perspective is super important in horror games because it puts distance between you and the action. A spook wouldn't work if you were looking at your character from an MMORPG angle, so being relatively close is the way to go. The action is right there, feet away from you, as if you were the backseat driver. But in first person, there is no distance. You are the action. This change means RE7 has a greater capacity for horror than any game in the series thus far, and it runs with it hard. In the first hour alone, you find your wife person, who is weirdly off, you lose her, the lights turn off, and then she transforms into a terrible monster right in front of your eyes. You're then forced to fight her off, not once nor twice, but 3 entire times as she simply refuses to relent. You get stabbed in the arm and the hand multiple times, she takes a killing blow with an axe, that doesn't kill her, and she punishes your sloppy aim by pinning you to the wall with a screwdriver and chainsawing your hand off. You then duke it out, gun versus chainsaw, until one of you dies. And then the game starts. Resident Evil doesn't stop being Resident Evil through this game. It still has dorky keys and puzzles. It still has an underground science lab. It still has an endgame that forgets that it's supposed to be scary and leans fully into action. But all of this is fine. This new setting and story for Resident Evil means these returning features are instead series hallmarks showing through and letting you know that even though this is Resident Evil and like anything you've seen before, it's still Resident Evil, baby. While this game wasn't considered a success at the time of its release, it has over time and through word of mouth garnered very respectable numbers compared to the series' highs. With this success riding the ship to some degree, what does Capcom do with this new goodwill? Easy. They simply won't miss. Resident Evil 2 Remake, a 2019 recreation of the 1998 original that basically throws out all the original game's mechanics in favor of building it from the ground up, recapturing the spirit and emotion of the original in a modern context. It changes some pieces of the story to make more sense with later games in the story. It changes the mechanics and camera to be more comfortable for modern use, but changes the movement style of zombies to maintain the difficulty of hitting them from the fixed camera tank control days. It completely revamps the mechanical reality of Mr. X, making him a roaming, invincible enemy who never leaves after spawning, some exceptions reply, adding a stressful wrinkle to your exploration through the second half of the police station. This game takes the original and lovingly recreates it, and it stands as my favorite Resident Evil game. What's next? Resident Evil 3 Remake, a 2020 release of the 1999 game Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. This game is much more experimental with the original text, which is interestingly in keeping with the experiment that Nemesis was in 1999. Even though these games are massively different, even in terms of tone, both are experimenting in the space. Nemesis, to see what new innovations could be made in survival horror, and 3 Remake, taking what was not a well-beloved game in the series and using that lack of care to explore new avenues with the game. They decide to make Resident Evil 3 into a feverishly fast-paced game where the pressure of Nemesis's pursuit pushes you to be daring and escape quickly. You have a dodge mechanic that can be used to perfectly dodge any attack, maintaining momentum. The level areas are small and never take more than a couple hours before pushing on to the next zone. Set piece after set piece after set piece, maintaining the fast pace as Jill rushes to escape, and Carlos rushes to finally get Jill to confess her love to him.
You'll have to circle around through an alley to your right to get there.
You mean the alley that's on fire?
Maybe. Surely a tall drink of water like yourself can put out a few flames. Fight it, Jill. You're gonna be okay. I promise.
My god, he's down so bad. This game didn't sell as well as the other two, but it still performed admirably, especially for a remake of a game few cared about. Finally, Resident Evil Village, a goofy as hell, campy as crap survival horror that takes place in a European village starring fantasy horror monsters of all things. Each area and villain is a different style of old horror novel-made material and have completely different types of horror and stress levels within each. There's classic Resident Evil, this time with vampires, absolutely terrifying psychological horror, fish, and body horror meets industrial hell. This game gets maximum goofy, but you knew that. If you're a Resident Evil fan, you knew that. This game's dumb and you love it. This game sold pretty good as well, and sets up characters who will continue to matter in installments later in the series. This may be a bad omen, who knows? They did this before and it went poorly last time, so we'll just have to see. So Resident Evil's over here, the king reborn and stronger than ever, and the other two started to stir in their dead slumbers. If there's money to be made in the AAA space, they're going to want to capitalize. So within the past year, Konami released a press conference revealing 4 different Silent Hill properties in the pipeline. And EA, not being one to refuse money, decided to reveal their own return in the form of Callisto Protocol, Dead Space Remake, which much like Resident Evil 2 Remake, seeks to capture the emotions of the original rather than the reality of it, maintaining the horror we remember from what is, admittedly looking back, a very bright and easy game. And open the floodgates for AAA horror games the world over. Days Gone, The Dark Pictures Anthology, Little Nightmares 1 and 2, Ghostwire Tokyo, Dying Light 2, The Quarry, the upcoming Dead Island 2, Capcom's Resident Evil 4 Remake, the list goes on. AAA horror is back, baby! And with a future looking so bright for the genre's most decorated titles, hopefully other studios take up the mantle and make their own horror games. Take new paths down a road of daring the player to turn your game off. Maybe revitalize some older horror franchises that died during the dry spell, I don't know. All that I know is, whether you're a fan of the indie that held up the genre during the studio's abandonment of it, or a fan of the modern resurgence made possible through RE7, it's a good frickin' time to be a horror fan. Conclusions are dumb, you watched the video, why do you want me to repeat myself? I will, I guess. Horror was good as a genre, then studios got eyes bigger than their stomachs and they pushed their developers to make highly profitable horror games. Along the way, most of them lost their identity and one just died from studio politics. In the dirge of AAA, indie horror games took up the space and made really interesting games that helped innovate the genre. Capcom then returned with RE7 and after releasing hit after hit after hit, reminded the other studios that horror is awesome, leading to a healthy horror hellscape we delightfully suffer within today. I am Superdude, thank you for watching. Hello again, thank you for watching. I'm a huge horror game fan, but it still required a lot of research to get this done, so if I mess anything up, please be, I don't know, forgiving of any mistakes that I made. As for recommendations, everyone should play Signalis. That's a new indie horror game made by 2 people. I believe it's called Rose Engine. Is the people who made it. It's great, fantastic little game. Also, everyone should play the Dead Space remake, obviously. Dead Space is my favorite of the 3 franchises I spoke about most on here, so please, get in there. Maybe they'll make more if you buy it. Anyway, yeah, thank you again very much for watching. I am John Wolf. I will see you around.